you so much for coming along to this session. It's the second in our series that we're running with the Economic Change Unit, Economics 101. We basically pulled all these together because we felt as though it was only really with a super strong understanding of the economy that the environment sector could both stay relevant and also make sure our arguments were strong. Just a really quick housekeeping up front. I just wanted to ask that please can everyone, and they have so far, which is brilliant, but please can you make sure you're muted when you're not speaking? And we're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you can get thinking while we're going through the presentation, then we will take all of those at the end. So on to today's topic, just a quick kind of upfront of why we chose to focus today on inflation. I think we're really keen to understand what causes it, what are the levers to get it under control. And I think a lot of us here will have gotten very used to hearing the word inflation thrown around a lot, but our collective understanding of what kind of underlies inflation will definitely vary between us, and particularly what we might think of as some of the solutions. So we are very happy to be joined here today by James, Senior Director at Opportunity Green, who's going to take us through a bit of a presentation on inflation. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, James. Thank you.
I was muted and I need to share my screen, which we just tested, so it should still work. Bonk. Can everybody now see this? Yes, there you go. That should be working. Okay, so I was asked to sort of do a kind of quick introduction to what inflation is, why it matters, where it comes from, what we might do about it. This is a fairly sort of critical take and a take that is more focused on the environment than some people's versions of this story about inflation would be. I'm going to go through the kind of the sort of the orthodox, the conventional account of inflation, and I'm going to get into what I think is the emerging sort of new reality and increasingly accepted, I think, even by the mainstream of economics, as the kind of reality of inflation that we're facing. And there's a big environmental story built into that. So anyway, I'll crack on, and there's time for questions at the end. Now, let's see if this, there we go. So the first one, look, the first thing to start with, and this is sort of, it's the basics, but it's also like worth bearing this in mind, is that inflation is the rate of price increase. So if you say how much of prices on average, and we'll come on to that on average bit, how much of prices on average increased over the last year, that gives you your headline rate of inflation. The last year is that 12 months. So from August to this year, August to last year, or September this year to September last year, how much on average have prices increased? It's not the level of prices, and this sort of gets stuck in people's heads, understandably, because like you can look at stuff and just go, it's really expensive, but inflation could be quite low. The graph here shows the inflation rates in the UK versus Switzerland. What you can see is actually, we're going to come back to this whacking great surge, which people will remember, I'm sure, coming out of COVID and the pandemic and the end of lockdowns. Big increase in inflation rates absolutely everywhere, really. Britain, North America, all the way across Europe. Switzerland, they're somewhat affected by it as well. But as you can see, the Swiss inflation rate is really quite a lot lower than inflation in the UK. There is a kind of secret to that, which I might come back onto later. However, if you go to Switzerland, you'll notice everything's really expensive, right? So the level of prices is high. They just don't move very much. Typically, stuff costs a fair bit more. I mean, can be about double for like basic food items relative to here. But the level of price change, that's the rate of inflation, is very much lower. So in other words, the rate of price change, excuse me, is much lower than in the UK. The level of prices is higher. Just keep those two things in your head when you're going through this. Now, how do we decide what that average is? The way that the Office for National Statistics does that, and every other national statistics body out there, you know, whichever country you go to, they'll use the same kind of technique here, is to say, okay, we've got something we're going to call the basket of goods, so actually goods and services, and this is going to be based on what the average consumer spends in the last month. Now, first of all, there is no average consumer, right? So this is a completely sort of statistically invented thing that they're going to do. But they're going to say, okay, if we take like how much spending there has been, what percentage of all the spending that's taken place by all the consumers in our economy, what percentage is spent on specific items? And then we will weight the price movement for each part of that by the proportion they spend on it. So if you're spending a very large amount of money on, well, food is probably, there is about 10% or so of average household spending in every given month. Okay, that's 10% of the inflation index. Travel, from the top of my head, is a bit below that. There are some things that eat up a lot more. Housing costs are enormous, as you can imagine. So that has quite a big impact on the average basket of goods, really basket of goods and services. And that's the average that you then go and look at as ONS and say, how much has this weighted average moved over the last year? And that gives you your rate of inflation. So if the average movement is 4% upwards, your rate of inflation is 4%. And round about in the UK at the minute, it's about 4.1% inflation. So that average basket of goods has gone up in price 4.1% over the last year. The detail in this is pretty wild. I've flagged pulled pork, which is what this is a picture of, in case you're wondering. Air fryers recently introduced. I think ONS included VR headsets last year, frozen berry. I mean, it's an extraordinary level of detail that the ONS survey gets into. Now, key to this is that nobody's actually the average. Like, nobody's spending that average basket of goods. It's a statistical kind of artifact that's invented to make the whole thing work. That has an important consequence, because what it means is that any individual's experience of inflation will differ from what the average says, right? Because it will depend on what you're actually buying, what you will feel in terms of inflation, what will happen to the budget that you have, the amount of money you have will depend on what you're going out to buy. And this is classically something that's really important in relation to income. It could be different things. You find that people who rent versus people who own their home experience a different rate of inflation for obvious reasons. Rental prices move more. But the classic one is that, broadly speaking, the poorer you are, the more you will be spending on essentials. So in other words, you're going to have to spend proportionately more on food, on heating your house, probably on housing costs in general, out of your income than somebody who's richer, who can also, they're still a person, right? There's still a basic amount of stuff they need to eat, but they don't need to spend as much of their income on it because they just eat and that's that. So even if they go out and they insist on caviar or whatever every single night, yeah, they're spending a bit more, but there's still kind of an elementary amount, a minimal amount they're going to need to spend just to like keep alive, right? So that's kind of what's going on there. There's sort of biology involved ultimately in this one. We're all people, we all need a certain amount of stuff. It's just that some people have more access to resources than others. So the people who don't have much access to resources have to spend more of their limited resources on staying alive and keeping warm and all that sort of stuff relative to people who have more. And that can be a real problem if, for instance, as has happened in the last few years, the prices of essentials have gone up more than the prices of stuff that isn't so essential. The price of food, for instance, food inflation has been very much higher over the last few years than the price of, well, VR headsets, for example, or plasma screen TVs and this sort of thing. That's one part of the problem. There's a bunch of text there that are clipped from the ONS website. I was hoping they'd have a nice graph to illustrate this, but it basically describes in some detail the difference in impacts in the last sort of 12 months between households at different parts of the income distribution. That's one part of the problem. The other one is sort of in some ways more fundamental, but probably less discussed, which is that, I don't very often, in fact, I have never bought a VR headset. To all intents and purposes, this is irrelevant. This price change is irrelevant to my experience of inflation. But if the price of that has fallen over the last 12 months, it will, in a small way, drag down the rate of inflation. On the other hand, I, like everyone else, have to eat quite often or I'll die. That's my experience of food inflation as a kind of weekly occurrence. You see this all the time, right? You have to keep spending the money on food and heating, electricity, and you have to spend money on clothes every so often. There's a few things out there, water bills, gas bills, all this stuff that you're spending repeatedly. And these are the things that have really moved up in price a lot over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, basically since the pandemic. And you see that much more often and you feel it much more often. It has more impact on your budget. The headline rate of inflation, because it's an average, doesn't really capture that impact. It's including the plasma screen TV that I haven't bought, as well as the long haul flights that I haven't taken. There's a whole stack of things that just aren't relevant, whereas we're all buying food. So you see that impact much more than the headline rate will tell you. Why does inflation happen? So there are two standard theories on this. Both are basically, to a significant extent, just wrong and increasingly wrong. But these are kind of the standard stories. The first one that you hear quite a lot, and it's popular typically with the sort of the sort of political right wing. It's associated historically with actually all sorts of people, but somebody like Milton Friedman, for instance, being advocate of free markets, who said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, a phrase that you get hit over the head with if you ever do a sort of undergraduate economics course. It boils down to the idea, and you probably have heard some version of this, that there's just too much money out there chasing too few goods. In other words, there's sort of everybody has too much money, so they're all going off to spend, but the same amount of goods and services are out there. So if you're selling a goods or service, you can increase your price, and somebody with a bit more money can go and bid for that, and thus the prices start to go up, right? So there's too much money chasing too few goods. Would be associated with things like government's printing money. The government's just gone, we're going to print a load of money and hand it out in some form, and therefore you get inflation. And now that can happen, right? And historically, you get periods of hyperinflation, very high inflation, where something like this process has taken place. The government has literally printed money. There's an argument in this country, and it's kind of, there are elements of truth to it, where quantitative easing, this process of the Bank of England electronically issuing more money, so it's not literally printing the stuff, but it's kind of creating more of it, has led to more money being out there, and then you get higher inflation. Now, Gary Stevenson, who people know as the sort of wealth tax campaigner, who I think does a really good job with that, does have something like this theory of inflation underneath a lot of what he says. He has this kind of view of why inflation has happened in the last few years. It's a sort of, we issued loads of money, therefore prices go up. The other standard theory is one to put in rather blunt terms here, but it's basically that inflation is caused by workers being greedy. The prices have gone up a bit. So if you're at work, you think prices have gone up, I'm going to argue for higher wages. And then your poor old boss has to pay you higher wages because you've gone and asked for higher wages. But that means, as well as you getting more money in your pay, your boss has to put up the price of whatever they're selling. And that's supposed to be the mechanism by which this occurs. This is the wage price spiral. And someone like Andrew Bailey, governor of the Bank of England, people might remember, it's a few years ago, where he was basically saying, yeah, inflation's high, we're asking for wage restraint to deal with this. The theory in his head, the theory actually in the Bank of England's models, is that inflation is caused by wages going up, forcing companies to put up prices, and therefore you get locked into this spiral, because if prices go up, everyone says, oh no, prices have gone up, you've got to put my wages up, and then it pushes up prices again, and round it goes. That's the theory. And why is my screen frozen? There we go. Why these theories are wrong today? Yes. Look, there's a simple, this doesn't match reality in neither case. You know, inflation here across Europe in particular surged after Russia invaded Ukraine. Right? How is that linked to there being too much money? It's not, you know, we did quantitative easing, therefore Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. This is not a thing that happened. This is not where inflation came from. QE did create a load of extra money. This is not the driver for why we get loads of inflation. The other one is wrong, because actually what happened when we had that big inflationary surge over like 2022-ish into 2024 or so, real wages fell. In other words, wages did not rise as fast as inflation. So this story about, oh, workers are asking for high wages and the bosses have to increase prices and then workers ask for more, that wasn't happening. Actually, prices were going up and wages were here and everyone got poorer, right? That's what a decline in real incomes and real wages means. So it just wasn't happening. Unions are weak. Few workers have real power at work. I mean, it's just not a thing that happens. Maybe in the 70s, you could tell this story. It doesn't apply now. So there's no evidence for wage price spirals. Very good paper from the International Monetary Fund, of all people, sort of points this out last year or so. The causality is all wrong. The mechanisms for making price rises happen just aren't really there in reality relative to the standard theory. So what we're looking at today is that inflation is increasingly driven by supply side factors, which is a bit of jargon, which means that the supply side is all those things that change the supply of goods and services in the economy. So it'll be how easy it is to make a new car, or how easy it is to grow olives in the Mediterranean, or how easy it is, a whole stack of things, right? That's the supply side. Russia invades Ukraine, sanctions are imposed, there's a restriction in effect on the amount of gas available in Europe, and the price goes up as a result. Critically for what we're talking about here, I think, because this is the bit where it's like, okay, maybe you get a war every so often, maybe something like this happens. The Houthi blockade of the Red Sea results in inflation across the world rising by 0.8 percentage points, because you can't send the ships through the Red Sea, so they all have to go much longer routes, the price goes up. These things can happen. They can happen, whereas on the environmental side, we pretty much know it will happen. There'll be more extreme weather events that affect harvests, for instance. There'll be more floods. There'll be more. You can go through a big list of them. We know that the environment is getting more unstable. And we know that this has an impact on the supply of all sorts of goods, often in peculiar ways. The Panama Canal was in a drought for the last few years. That restricts the amount of ships that go through it. That means it's more costly to send things around by ship. That starts to add to inflation because the price is going up. The example I want to pick there is drought and disease in West Africa, which is where the majority of the world's cocoa is grown over 2023 to 2024. The price of cocoa surges, and that means the price of chocolate surges. And as an incidental to that, and a version of inflation is you may have seen all the stories about how everybody's Easter eggs are shrinking, shrinkflation, to use the term. And it's a version of that same process playing out. So this gets labeled with the name of climate inflation. In other words, you have climate change, you get more extreme weather events, you get more sort of disruptions to supply across the world. And as a result of that, you start getting prices going up. For instance, the Panama Canal and the Rhine dried up over the last few summers. You can't send a boat loaded with goods down it anymore. It costs more to transport things, therefore, and that means that prices rise as a result. Extreme heat in Sichuan in China in 2022 meant that factories had to close. They were too hot for people to work, and in addition, the local authorities prioritized making sure power was available for people running air conditioning units in their homes over the demands of factories. So about 2 weeks, factories closed. This is a supply side shock. This is going to lead to price increases, other things being equal. Note that if the price of something has gone up, you, if you are selling that thing, can do rather well out of this. You, if you have to buy that thing, are going to be worse off. But if you're selling the thing that has gone up in price, and people typically may not have very much choice about buying that thing, like you're selling natural gas in Europe in 2022, you will make a lot of money, which is exactly what, for instance, the fossil fuel companies did over that period of time. This is just a couple of quick clippings from a really good, really thorough bit of work by Maximilian Kotz and his team at the Potsdam Institute, as was from 2024, a modeling of how climate change, forecasts of climate change impact on different parts of the world will start to affect projected rates of inflation over those different parts of the world. Their sort of thing is that food price inflation has another 2% added onto it across sub-Saharan Africa by 2035. If we have a really sort of a more catastrophic version of what happens to climate change over the next sort of 40, 50 years or so, then food price inflation goes absolutely haywire over that period of time. And that's a kind of looking into the future and trying to make some predictions about where this is likely to end up. This is just a quick point on climate inflation and climate profits. It was a story in Bloomberg over the summer that just was so striking. Cargill, for people who don't know, is one of the 4 or 5 really large agribusinesses that control an extraordinarily large amount of the world's food supply. Cargill, for instance, is controls about 20% of America's grain supplies, that sort of thing. They also have huge interests in chocolate. They've just made in the last year, it's a privately held company, so it doesn't actually publish public accounts, but the accounts got leaked. They're owned by members of the Cargill family, sort of descendants of the people who set it up. They paid out record dividends. I mean, you're talking $1.5 billion, I think was the total, on the back of a big increase in profits, which in their annual report said was due to them being able to source loads and loads of cocoa beans from Ghana, which was hit by drought, in order to sell them at a much higher price and make loads of profits out the back of it. And it's such a striking example, I thought, of how that process operates. You get the drought and the disease, which is due to an interaction, in this case, between climate change and El Nino, really. But then you get the lack of supply, you get the surge in the prices, and you get a big company in the middle making a whacking great profit out of the middle of it. Final slides, conventional response to all of this, as people will know, I'm sure, is to basically say the central bank will put up interest rates. The theory behind that is quite blunt, and it relates directly to this idea that inflation is sort of due to workers being a bit greedy. The theory is that if interest rates go up, it is harder for companies to borrow cash. If it's harder for companies to borrow money, they'll invest less. That means they'll employ fewer people. If they're employing fewer people, unemployment goes up. If unemployment goes up, workers become more scared about asking for a pay rise because they might just lose their jobs and get a sack. That will discipline workers, that will restrain wage demands, that will help pull down inflation. So it's a disciplinary thing, ultimately running through the labour market. That's how the central bank, in this case the Bank of England, when it puts up interest rates, that's how their model says they think it's going to restrain inflation. This is obviously not actually working. The Bank of England has a 2% inflation target. It's been consistently above that for about 3-4 years now. It's about 4.5% at the minute. Same applies across much of the rest of the developed world. Everyone has a target of about 2%. Everybody has inflation typically, apart from the Swiss, above that. So it's obviously not working, on the basis of recent experience. It also doesn't really work in theory. If you put up the interest rate here, it doesn't sort of stop Russia invading Ukraine, right? It doesn't cause more cocoa to grow in Ghana. It doesn't end a drought in the Mediterranean. This is just, he's pulling this lever. It doesn't do anything because you're dealing with problems in supply, driven often and increasingly by environmental factors. It could also be quite bad to put up interest rates. If you want to stop people investing to sort of cool the economy down, then the fact the interest rates have gone up means they're also going to invest less in like renewable technologies. And this is one of the reasons why wind turbine manufacturers have hit such problems. The interest rate has gone up, it becomes more expensive to borrow and invest in wind turbines. So they're all facing a crisis around that, even before Donald Trump and his curious prejudices turned up on this one. So better to keep interest rates low and be a bit careful about who you lend to. Better to coordinate what the central bank is doing with what the rest of government is doing. So you don't have an independent central bank doing whatever it feels like. You try and coordinate the two things. And then you can think about more interventionist policies out the other end. You might want to restrict profiteering in some ways. Isabella Weber, very good US-based economist, has presented the case for strategic price controls on particular goods when they're hit by a shock. She also says you can have a stock, a reserve supply of essentials when it faces those sort of restrictions. There's also final slide, or final two slides. There's no point trying to say to people, you need to hold your wages down if there's loads of supply side shocks. We ought to be saying we need to protect wages and incomes. We ought to be thinking of ways to make sure that people are insulated from all those shocks happening. I flagged there an interesting new proposal around basic income for farmers who are particularly subject, obviously, to these shocks on the food system. But climate change in general increases volatility, uncertainty. So there's a role for government in trying to stabilize household incomes and to stabilize specific important industries. Final bit is all of this is politically sort of hugely, it's like just giving everything a big shake. Inflation is always politically destabilizing. We've seen that over the last year or so. Although the cost of living crisis is less discussed in this country and elsewhere, there's been government after government battered by this. The Japanese government was thrown out of office largely on the back of the cost of living crisis, soaring price of rice in Japan on the back of environmental crises. Just over last summer, Narendra Modi, despite predictions, lost his majority. Again, the cost of living crisis, a major part in that. Trump's victory, I mean, Donald Trump spent the entire campaign basically trooping around the country saying, do you feel better off than you did 4 years ago? And after that surge in inflation, most people say, no, I do not. And thus he wins. So it's politically destabilizing on top of everything else. I'm going to stop at that point and happy to take some questions and comments, I suppose.
Amazing. Thank you so much, James, for setting that out so clearly. There's a bunch of questions that are already in the chat that I can see rolling in, so that's brilliant. I just wondered quickly before we turn to those, if you had any reflections on this current government, and I suppose particularly Rachel Reeves, what you think their view might be of inflation and which of these kind of doctrines they might hold.
Oh, sorry. Just I was reading one of the questions and I missed your.
So I was just asking what you think the current government's view of inflation might be, in particular, I suppose Rachel Reeves, which of the doctrines they might hold on to on the causes of inflation.
Well, they are clinging very determinedly because it was a Labour government who set in place this business about an independent Bank of England. So they're clinging very determinedly onto that. They see it as like politically a really crucial part of it. So implicitly, although if you ask Rachel Reeves, she says basically inflation is a thing for the Bank of England to manage and park that problem over there. Implicitly, they're accepting the bank's view of how inflation should be managed, which is that the interest rate that the bank sets is the primary tool that you use to manage pretty much the only tool really that you use to manage inflation. And although this isn't often sort of said publicly, what you're actually doing with that is trying to cause something like a small recession in order to stop people asking for such big pay rises. Right? That's me saying in more crude terms what the underlying economic model is doing. So they actually think this. They don't want to touch central bank independence. They believe that if they do touch that, there'll be a massive panic in the markets. They'll lose control of inflation. All hell will break loose, and all the rest of it. I think that's a position that's becoming somewhat unworkable.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'll read out a few questions from the chat, and if there are any more questions and people want to raise their hands, then please do start doing that. For those who aren't familiar with Zoom, your hand is in the react button at the bottom, there. The first one was from Gareth, which is, do supermarkets also use the basket for price comparisons, which means price of things in the basket like milk are artificially depressed to keep the appearance of cheapness?
I'm not quite sure where that thing is coming from. The supermarkets in this country are in a slightly peculiar situation in that depending on where they are in the supply chain, they may or may not have a great deal of market power. Like for things that are imported, they are kind of price takers from the rest of the world. So Tesco's versus Cargill doesn't actually have that much power or influence over what's happening there. On things like when they're buying milk from farmers, they have, as a big buyer, a certain amount more power in that. But what you find is that supermarket profit margins are pretty tight. So they're relying on selling a lot of stuff with not very much profit on each thing to a large number of people. Right? That's how they do it. So Tesco's can make very substantial profits by volume, but on each thing that they're selling, often not very much. They're more on the pass-through end of where the supply shocks are happening rather than like the people who've managed to really integrate themselves as powerful middlemen like Cargill's and Bunge and all the other sort of major grain and fertilizer and seed suppliers. They're the people who really sit with a great deal of market power. I don't know if that quite answers the question.
Well, if Gareth wants to come in and ask any follow-up question, then please do. Yeah, go for it, Gareth.
Thanks. Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Grand. Okay. Yeah. No, I was really probing that between supermarkets. There's a lot of talk about the basket at Lidl is cheaper than the basket at Tesco, and I've heard that means that items in the basket, like for example a pint of milk, supermarkets have a lot of incentive to keep those low, even below cost price, which mean they then go back to producers and force sales at below the cost price. I was just wondering whether the government basket is the same as the supermarket basket and how supermarkets operate in this environment, really. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, now I get it. Yeah, there's a great deal of sort of game playing by large companies, because ultimately you're there to make profit. So what you're doing, particularly in a situation where there's only like a few of you, I mean, how many major supermarkets are there now in Britain? About 4 or 5, right? So this is not a sort of overall a competitive market in any usual sense, because it's not like loads of firms all trying to sell the same thing. It's this situation economists call oligopoly. So there's a great deal of game playing and bargaining and implicit sort of behavior by those supermarkets basically all the time in terms of how they operate any strategy. And they will, and you can see this, and thinking about it at various points as being investigated, they will try and sell things at below cost price because they want to take market share. And then once they've got the market share, they'll put the price up again, or they want to negotiate with suppliers on the other side. The government basket is not working in the same way because the government isn't acting as a buyer. This is simply a record of what is being sold. I don't doubt that, like, because of what's in the basket, it will change how different companies operate. For instance, if you're a mobile phone operator, like, you'll often have a contract which is, here's a price, and then we're going to set it to inflation plus a little bit. Train companies doing the same thing. So what changes in that basket will in fact change the profit you can make if you're using that sort of inflation plus pricing. You see that in quite a few service industries. But the government itself doesn't have the same incentives to sort of game the system quite so much. There are potential changes to that. When Liz Truss's short-lived government introduced the energy price guarantee in 2022, this whacking great attempt to suppress the price of energy for households in Britain. Very expensive way to do it, not necessarily the smartest way to do it, but they had to go. That actually reduced the headline rate of inflation because it basically pulled down the price rise in energy that households were paying. That's in the basket of goods. So ONS just recorded it as a big decrease. And that's because of government action, right? So that's something the government did that made overall inflation come down in a very direct, immediate sort of way at significant expense.
Right, amazing. Thanks, James. The next one is on the Cargills and the cocoa piece that you were talking about, which is shouldn't the Cargills of the world have to pay the farmers in Ghana proportionally more for the scarce cocoa? How do they swing the profit so much when they aren't the producer?
This is such a good question because I think it's crucial to understanding how a lot of these markets operate. And one of the issues we're seeing with this combination of climate shock and then profiteering out the other side, it is a story of market power. That if you've got, if you take the cocoa supply chain, there are four now, maybe three, actually, they had a couple of mergers and things, three companies that are stitched up about 70, 80% of the entire supply chain amongst themselves. They are the buyers who buy the cocoa from the places where it is grown and take it over to the places where it's turned into chocolate, which is typically in Amsterdam is where a lot of stuff is landed. A great deal of this is made in Europe, as you can imagine. There are other sites around the world. They control that part of the process. They are very, very big, very well funded companies facing, in the case of West Africa, you're talking 5-6 million cocoa bean growers, the majority of whom are earning less than $2 a day. And they, as big companies, are very powerful, and millions of cocoa growers operating often in very marginal environments, directly being hit by climate change, are not in a position of great strength versus those big buyers. Now, the governments, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, both try and influence this. They're trying to set minimum price standards, but because they're up against very large companies who control what the supply chain is doing, they are also in a weak position. So you have this horrible situation where, although supply is restricted over here, that doesn't necessarily translate into cocoa growers doing much better on the back of it, because those profits accumulate where you have these sort of choke points in the supply chain, which are where the large agribusinesses sit. The other bit also, I didn't really touch on this, but it's historically, and it's still an important part, is the role of speculation in all of that. That if you are frantic, if you're sitting in London on the commodity futures exchange, frantically buying up cocoa that will be distributed and sold in the future, you're going to start trying to bid up the price. You have an incentive to not sell so much. You have an incentive to speculate, to restrict the price, to restrict the supply, to try and also intervene in that supply chain and drive the price up so you can claim that without necessarily paying anything more back to the people who are growing it. And actually, if you have to pay more, that's a loss of profits to someone at some point in the system. So ultimately, this is a question of market power and power in the system. If you're a big, powerful company, you don't have to, and you won't necessarily pay a fair price to cocoa growers.
Thanks, James. Interesting and horrifying at the same time. So thanks for saying that out. We have a question here from Charles, which is, are high interest rates worse for green tech than normal because they all seem to have high upfront costs?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a very particular thing where once interest rates start rising, it reduces the willingness of people who are looking to invest in more risky things. So, broadly, like I think this is actually changing genuinely, but like broadly, historically, investing in their sort of unpleasant fossil fuel extractive industries is a relatively safe bet, and off you go and do that. Last few years, it's increasingly looking like a rather more volatile situation as the demand for fossil fuels in at least some forms drains from the system. Whereas investing in clean tech, which has for a long period of time been more dependent on various forms of government intervention, on subsidies, on things like this to actually get it off the ground, has looked like a more risky bet. So yes, I think there is a definite problem with interest rate rises hitting things that look a bit riskier, and also things that are longer term, right? If interest rates go up and you're only looking at 1 year, that's not so bad. If you're looking at like 100-year investment because you want to go off and build finally a tidal wave power generator, right? That's a 100-year lifespan. An increase in interest rates now that then drags out for 100 years is absolutely enormous. So it affects long-term infrastructure construction as well. If you want to upgrade the grid, which we need to do, because if we want to get renewable energy working properly, that's a big long-term investment. Rising interest rates means it's less likely to happen.
Thank you, James. Great question, Charles. One from Rosie here, which is, are there any useful heuristics or rules of thumb for understanding where strategic price controls can be effective?
I think, yeah, Isabella Weber, I think, details some of this. The one that sort of sticks out is there's a bit about, is it an essential of some sort, and is it a product that feeds into many other products? So there are certain kinds of basic foods, sort of maize, maybe in the US, corn, soy, that sort of thing. There are certain types of products that get used everywhere and are very close, or actually are like essential consumption. So anything in food might well be a bit along those lines. And that would start to look like the things you want to stockpile. I mean, we used to stockpile all sorts of stuff in this country and across the world. Up until 1995, Britain was maintaining stockpiles of food, originally as part of Cold War planning. The theory being, probably correctly, that in the event of nuclear war, we'd have trouble getting food from anywhere. And so it was a good idea to keep some as a stockpile. Now, as the threat of nuclear war apparently disappears, and in particular, as you get an idea, which actually worked for a long period of time, to be fair, that in a big globalized market, you can source food from all over the world. You don't have to worry about keeping a stockpile. This was just got rid of as an unnecessary cost for government. You don't need the storage. We did something similar with gas storage. That it was just felt, what's the point storing natural gas in case we need it, in case of the shocks of the system, when there's a big international gas market we can always buy gas from. So we got rid of that a few years ago as well. It's now increasingly, I think, looking like something of a mistake to behaving this way, that we know a big globalized market can be subject to huge shocks. And we also know that thanks to climate change, these kinds of shocks are going to be more likely. So I think she presents a good case for thinking, at least thinking about what it might look like to try and protect people from those sorts of shocks, and where in the various supply chains and what sort of commodities you might have to think about to do this. By the way, a lot of larger, at least developing countries already have this. I mean, India has a rice supply, a strategic supply. China does the same thing, and they have done for some period of time. That kind of logic is starting to creep in, I think, in the developed world as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. A couple really interesting ones here from Amira. Firstly, on what was Switzerland's secret low inflation, and also why don't we use a basket of essential goods instead?
Oh, these are two great questions. I'm so sorry. I did actually miss out. Why is Swiss inflation low? The big dirty secret of Switzerland, of why inflation is low there, is that about a third of prices in Switzerland, I mean, covering everything from like football and theatre tickets to transport tickets, are actually controlled by the government. They have a very, very comprehensive price control regime with quite a sort of consensual basis between producers and consumers and the government for setting what prices will look like in various industries. And it actually has worked remarkably well at helping suppress price inflation over the last few years. And you get these kind of slightly grudging notes from, research divisions of various banks writing, well, actually, a large part of what Switzerland's doing is something that standard economic theory tells you is a very bad idea. So I think there's something to learn from that, because if you start saying, well, government can start to set what happens with prices, there's a big hue and cry that goes, oh my God, it's going to be like Venezuela or something. Well, no, I mean, you should do a good version of this and be a bit more like Switzerland, rather than like do a daft version of this and provoke shortages of toilet paper or whatever the usual sort of rhetoric is in that one. On the basket of essential goods, I think that's a really good question, because there is a version of this that economists sometimes use, where they start talking about core and non-core inflation. And the core inflation is a very weird one, because it cuts out something that economists don't want to talk about, which is precisely all those essential items that are most subject to wobbling up and down. So if you ever see an economist talking about core and non-core inflation is the one with all those things that are quite essential taken out. Non-core inflation is energy and food in particular, and that's actually quite close to what is happening to those essentials prices. And that, I think, is the one that is going to be increasingly important over time. Historically, that's happened because the standard view in economics is that, well, if inflation is set by wage rises, leading to price rises, provoking more wage rises, what we need to look at is stuff that we're actually making in Britain or wherever. And we need to focus on this core, because that's the really difficult part of inflation. We need to think about how people are selling the services that they're selling, what kind of wages they're asking for. And we can ignore all this stuff that's imported or subject to seasonal variation. It doesn't matter so much. What's happening now is all that stuff that's imported and subject to seasonal and climate variation is starting to dominate everything else. So non-core inflation is quite close to what you're talking about.
Funny that it's non-core and then core. It feels almost like it should be entirely the other way around.
Yes, it's completely back to front. Yeah.
Yeah. A bit of a longer one here from Rachel, but so I don't know if you want to come in and ask it yourself, Rachel. Otherwise, happy to ask it. But I think the general question is that the cost of buying a house is not factored in. But so would the UK national inflation not be even higher if house price increases had been factored in?
Yeah, this is a very good question the ONS has sort of gone round and round for years and then tried to solve, which is there's a very peculiar thing that the international international standard for how you calculate inflation did not include housing costs, including mortgage costs, for instance, as well as rental costs for a long period of time. So CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is the measure that the Bank of England uses to work out what inflation is, and without getting sort of technicalities, there's been all sorts of criticisms around that, apart from ones I've raised. There's some sort of peculiar maths going on behind it, but let's just take that. That's the one they actually look at. And then CPIH includes the additional housing costs, which is rents and what we call owner-occupied housing costs, which is basically what you're paying for your mortgage. That is a problematic one because if you look at Britain now, and I'm doing this from the top of my head, I think it's about what is it? It's about 40%. It's a majority of people who are owner-occupiers now own their houses outright. Right, so house prices can go up, and this is a pure gain for them. Interest rates can change, and it makes no difference if you have a mortgage. So it's just not having that impact in the way it used to. If you're renting, on the other hand, all this stuff will feed in immediately, and any changes in the price of rent will feed in immediately and very directly and obviously into your actual kind of quality of life. You know, you've got the same house or flat, whatever, the rent goes up, you're just worse off. That's all that's happened at this point in time. So it's sort of complex. Because of changes in the structure of the housing market over time. As we get more and more people paying off their mortgages, like the impacts of changes in house prices and changes in notional housing costs start to impact fewer and fewer people. So lucky them, I suppose.
A big question here from Tilly, which is to what extent was the energy price crest in the UK being driven just by supply side issues versus greed inflation?
Well, it's to be honest, it's kind of both, and this is annoying because it takes a sort of what is a relatively simple story and turns it into something more complicated. But look, I mean, put it this way: the surge in prices over the last few years and the ongoing, I mean, the food inflation is still much higher than it was, and it's creeping upwards. Isn't just big companies decided spontaneously to be more greedy than they were, right? There was a sort of thing that pushed them to be able to act like that. The thing that pushed them really strikingly in energy markets, natural gas in particular, was a change in supply conditions, in this case occasioned by Russia invading Ukraine and the sanctions regime and the restrictions on supply and everything else. And that was exploited. And that was exploited by large companies. And in that case, it was like, you know, this is a sort of market response that they profit from quite passively. In some cases, you find a slightly more active process where I think it happens quite a bit in food, where you have there's a restriction in supply, and a large dominant company can use its market power at that point in time to drive up prices and make higher profits out of it. It can translate a problem in the supply of cocoa beans, for instance, into profits for itself over here. Now that is something, and I know I've mentioned her again, but I think she's an absolutely brilliant economist. Isabella Weber wrote a very good paper about 3 years ago looking at seller's inflation, which is a theory of how large companies can exploit supply side shocks to deliver their profits and also drive up inflation. And those two things are right together. So it's a combination, and that's complexity in this, right? That's the kind of the unpleasant reality of a world hit by climate change, where you have big companies, is that this will start to turn into rising prices and rising profits for those companies. But I think you have to get the two things together.
Thank you, James. Great. And George has very handily put a short press release in the chat, which explains some of that work. One from Apar here, which is, are there more regional measures of inflation?
I'm trying to think. I think every so often, I'm trying to remember if ONS produces this. I think every so often they do a kind of update which looks a bit at how prices vary across the country, but they don't do it regularly or consistently. So you can go back and find every so often you get a little measurement where they tried to do this. But it's a good question because prices do vary a fair bit from one end of the country to the other, like house prices we all know about. But it's also like what you have to pay for food or drink and a few other things that start to vary a bit. So they have at times in the past produced that measure for this country. It's not very consistent or done particularly often. I think basically because I think the data requirements, at least historically, would be quite great. Right? You have to have, instead of just going to one place and saying how much does this cost, you have to go to 6 or 7 different places and say how much does the same thing cost, and try and make sure it's the same thing you're looking at everywhere. So it's an expensive exercise to do. Frankly, I think with the sort of fact you can just guzzle data up from absolutely anywhere now, it's probably getting a lot cheaper to do something like this. It's relatively easier to go and find an entire price series for a supermarket and all the products that they have, or to at least get a computer to grab that and look at it. So I think in theory, they could start doing a bit more work in this, but it's not done consistently or regularly.
Interesting, thank you. Another one from Charles, which is how important are services to inflation? It sounds like most of it's about material goods, and we're a service economy.
Yeah, I think that's not just us. I mean, any large developed country by this point is mostly a services economy. We're more of an outlier. I mean, manufacturing is about 8-9% of GDP by this point. If you go to Germany, it's much higher, between 15 and maybe even 20%. The US, it's still quite high. So we're a bit of an outlier, but basically everywhere is a more service economy. Now, that has had a couple of impacts on this. One is that it sort of limits the impact on your headline measure inflation as to the size of that impact when you get a shock from the rest of the world. So if you get a big climate change based inflationary shock, like olive oil is a really good one. Everyone's seen prices up about 150% over the last 2 years or so due to a drought in the Mediterranean. Can't grow as many olives, less olive oil, price goes up. That is certainly part of what's happening, but it whacks into a load of service sector things that aren't being directly impacted by this, that don't move so much. And where importantly, you just have lots and lots of people who don't have, when they're at work, they're not in a very powerful position. They don't have a strong trade union. They're not going to be able to translate any of this into demands for higher wages. I mean, we did start to see, people remember there was a strike wave. We did start to see a bit of that, but it wasn't very much, and most people still seeing their wages fall. So it kind of acts as a shock absorber in that sense, because you have a lot of the economy that just sort of soaks this up. When I say a lot of the economy that just sort of soaks this up, the reality is that means a lot of us just soaking this up. If the price of some food goes up, you're just going to have to suck that up, right? And that's what lots and lots of people are doing. The number of people who report borrowing money to spend on essentials like food is on the increased quite sharply in the US, and I believe it's a similar thing here. So we are the shock absorbers at that point, because we don't have the market power to turn around to our employers typically and say, pay me more money because the price of some essential has gone up. So I think from a headline point of view, isn't that good? Because it means the inflationary impact is not so big. From the actual lived experience point of view, it's quite bad, because it just means you're going to have to pay more money for something that's essential, and you don't have many options to do anything about it.
Thank you so much, James. I think this is the final question I can see. So if you have any others that you have burning answers to, or burning questions even, for burning answers, whatever the phrase is, please chuck them in the chat or raise your hand. Otherwise, this one from Tobias is, are there any signs of the government's view on causes of inflation starting to change, or any advocacy for this change?
I think so. I think it's starting to sink in. I mean, you see this in some quite surprising places. It's particularly surprising that the European Central Bank is probably the leading major central bank looking at this sort of question. They've done a lot of very good work around the impact of climate inflation. If you want to dig it out, Christine Lagarde's speech at the Jackson Hole conference in 2023, was it 2024, was just a very clear, and she's president of the European Central Bank, a very clear exposition of like the case for thinking about climate inflation and understanding how real world supply shocks generated by climate change are becoming a bigger and bigger factor in the inflation we experience. And also, of course, if you're a fairly self-interested government, you'll be looking at what's happened to a whole bunch of governments facing election over the last 12 months and starting to think, okay, you're going to have to do something about this. So it's starting to change, but it's only changing very, very slowly. And some of this stuff is changing very slowly in terms of what is the policy that now starts being done. I mean, central banks in particular are still basically behaving the same. Christine Lagarde sits at the top of the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank hasn't changed its policy on how to deal with inflation at all. So she can say whatever she wants. the actual outcome has not really changed very much here. And in some cases, it's getting worse. I mean, the Bank of England has cut its funding for research into climate change and its financial and monetary impacts. And it's absolutely crap, this stuff. The Federal Reserve in the US has been doing the same thing, slightly more understandably, if not really wisely, but at least understandably why you do that, because you want to suck up to Donald Trump. But it's like this is moving in the wrong direction in at least some parts of the world, and it's bad news. It's bad news from a self-interested government point of view, because you're going to be sitting there with more and more shocks happening. Like, we know what the climate models say, this is what's going to happen, and you're going to have a worse and worse story to tell people about why it's happening and what you're going to do about it.
Thank you so much, James. I'm so impressed by the range of questions you just answered in such a short space of time. So thank you so much for doing that. That was really, really incredible. Any final questions? I'll just give 2 more seconds just in case there is anybody that hasn't had a chance to ask theirs yet. Go for it, George.
Sorry, just trying to unmute myself. Just because someone mentioned Andy Burnham above, Andy Burnham's pitch, right? He like very vaguely went into wanting to nationalize, take more essentials into public ownership so he could lower the price and lower the cost of living. And like the government's response to that was, oh, you're fiscally irresponsible, there'd be a bond market crisis. What do you think about that, James? How would you rebut that?
I mean, look, wow. Okay, chuck that in at the end. The first bit is, look, he's basically right. It would be better to have some form of more public control over a bunch of essential industries, of which in this country, because we've just gone far further than most other developed countries in privatizing things. That includes water, energy, so gas and electricity supplies. It would be better to have that measure of control. Nationalization would give you that and would make it easier in some cases, the sort of longer term planning. So, we want lots of renewables. We want to insulate ourselves from shocks in the rest of the world. We want to make a more secure energy system. We're going to have to invest massively in the grid. No private company is going to do that because it's a very long-term investment with limited profits out the other side. It's got to be government. That starts to look like a case of public ownership. It's one part of it. The bit that kind of gets forgotten is they also need to change how these companies are arranging their prices. It's not enough to just go, okay, we've nationalized this not very good system with its weird price setting mechanisms. I mean, there's the reason why we have higher energy prices here is because the price of energy is determined by this business of what is the marginal unit of energy, the electricity that you can buy from the system at any point in time. And if that marginal price goes up, so for instance, there's a massive supply shock in Europe and the marginal price has gone up, in practice that translates rapidly into how much people have to pay domestically. That's a ridiculous situation because it means that renewable energy, which on balance is getting cheaper and much cheaper, is not being priced properly because it's actually attached to a whole bunch of marginal gas energy production, and it means that people are paying more than they need to, even though we're installing a lot of renewables. So you have to change that whole pricing structure. You have to have a government that's prepared to go into a market and say, we're going to price things differently. That's not free. That's not like this is just magic up a new price and everything's fine. If you're importing gas, you're going to have to pay the price of that gas import. So it could well cost you some money to do some of this, but you're going to have to do that. In terms of bond market panicking, and it's a slightly bigger, different question. Look, I think the main thing with the bond markets is they're not political. Like, they don't sit there. You don't sit there as a bond trader cackling and rubbing your hands and saying, how can we destroy a left-wing government? I mean, there may be a few people doing this, but it's not really how the markets behave. They want to make money. And the way they're going to make money over the longer term is they want to see stability. They want to see like a plan of some sort. They want to know that if you invest in this particular government, you get that money back at a slight profit. That's what they want. And governments that can offer stability and a plan and say that, okay, we have a lot of public support, for example, for our program, which is something, to his credit, Andy Burnham said he would want. That is a government in a better place than one, I have to be frank, that is sort of crashing up against its own fiscal rules every so often and can't persuade its own backbenchers to do a bunch of cuts to get out of that mess. Right? That's not a stable situation. That's why you've seen bond market prices, the price of government borrowing, creep up over the last 12 months or so. So stability, that's what you need. And stability, you need a big public consensus. And to get that, you need, I think, quite a broad argument about how we're running the economy and what we could be doing differently.
Really interesting, James. Thank you so much. And yeah, no small question to finish on there, but that was brilliant. Thank you so much. yeah, can't see any other questions, so I guess we will call it there a few minutes early. Just say another huge thank you to James for taking the time to be here and for such a clear session. Thanks everyone for coming along. We will be running another one of these sessions, Economics 101, and we'll be thinking about tax. So please do come back, and we will deep dive further into the UK economy. But thank you so much, James, and thanks everyone. See you soon.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.